Naya grew up in a rundown neighborhood in a large American metropolis, where old houses with peeling paint lined narrow streets that became even more eerie after dark. She was the oldest child in a poor family, and from a very young age, poverty became something of an integral part of her reality. But against all odds, Naya always had two dreams: to escape from these deprived neighborhoods and to win respect through a good education. She was convinced that high grades in college admission were her only chance to have a decent future. As early as 11 years old, Naya helped her mother sort through old clothes, which they then sold at the local flea market. At 14, she started working part-time, handing out leaflets at bus stops. By the time she was 18, she was finally convinced that surviving in this environment would require tremendous effort. But despite the daily difficulties, she was considered an exemplary student at school. She wrote the best essays, and her teachers praised her knowledge of history. Few people realized how intense and exhausting these achievements were for her. Many sleepless nights, stress, and constant exhaustion. When Naya entered college, she believed that she finally had a chance for the best. Despite the lack of money, she was awarded a small scholarship, and to support herself, she worked wherever she could, attending classes during the day and becoming a cashier in a small shop in the evening, sometimes working in a warehouse on weekends. She rented a room in a poor neighborhood where safety was extremely poor. In the winters, it got dark quickly, and the walk home from the store turned into a silent test of nerves. One day, walking out late at night after her shift, Naya pulled on an old fake jacket. It was piercingly cold outside, and gray snow patches mixed with mud left ugly tracks along the roads. The last bus had left 40 minutes ago, so she had to walk 4 blocks before turning into her alley. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the half-empty streets. Occasionally, cars would pass by, but soon the sound of their engines would fade away, and the city would fall back into silence. I kept hearing my mother's words in my head: "Daughter, you'd better call a taxi." But as usual, there was no money for a taxi. Tired and deep in thought, Naya didn't even notice that the streetlight on the corner had gone out. Three figures were already hiding there, merged into the darkness. It was hard to tell if they were grown men or older teenagers. They all wore dark clothes and deep hoods. Naya walked on, barely hearing the strangers following her in her gut. Suddenly, she felt a sharp tug on her sleeve. It was as if a cold bullet hit her in the chest. She tried to push the offender away, but the second one had already firmly grabbed her arms from behind. Dark spots of shock and fear appeared before her eyes. She heard intermittent, aggressive shouts with foul language. In desperation, Naya jerked, trying to scream, but the third silhouette deftly clamped her mouth shut. Her heart was pounding as if it was about to jump out of her chest, and her panic was evident in every breath she took. It was hard to see anything but vague silhouettes in the twilight. One seemed taller than the others, another short and stocky, and a third emitted a pungent odor of burning. She did not recognize any faces, any characteristic features, and any attempt to scream was instantly stopped by brute force. It seemed like a nightmare from which she was about to wake up, but the horror was quite real. Three unidentified men threw her down on the cold asphalt and held her until she lost the strength to fight. Only a few minutes, when no one was driving by, were enough for these attackers to take away her vestiges of safety and dignity. Having done their dirty work, they disappeared, leaving her alone, without a single clue or sign that could help investigators. Naya remained lying on the damp asphalt, sobbing in pain and humiliation, while wet stains on her clothes stuck to her skin in disgusting patches, and everything around her seemed to be falling apart. For a moment, she sat curled up with her arms around her knees, her body seemingly petrified and refusing to move. Then, shivering from the cold and shock, she stood up with difficulty and made her way to her home. She did not tell any of her neighbors anything. She just sat in the bathroom for a long time, looking at her bruises and scratches, clutching a crumpled handkerchief with tears to her chest. She cursed herself in her head. Why didn't she call a taxi? Why didn't she ask a college friend to walk her home? But the thought of going to the police scared her even more. She didn't get a good look at the attackers, no witnesses, no descriptions. What if they did find them? Endless interrogations, court proceedings, stigma. It all seemed like an insurmountable burden that she didn't know how to deal with. This was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come, as it turned out that, in addition to moral trauma, the rape had left her with something else. 2 or 3 weeks passed, but Naya was constantly exhausted. At first, she blamed her weakness on stress. How could she not get depressed after such events? She missed school, staying home for so many days, crying at night, and hiding traces of insomnia and tears behind dark glasses during the day. Time and again, she put off going to the police, making excuses to herself. In the meantime, she had to go back to her part-time jobs to pay for her housing and food. When her temperature spiked to 38 and didn't go down for several days, she finally realized that it wasn't just a mental shock. At first, she suspected a common cold, but having the simplest insurance, she went to the city clinic where she made an appointment and stood in a long line. After checking her, the doctor there decided to take her blood for analysis and ordered tests for infections. Her pallor, neck rash, and heavy sweating at night were too suspicious. "Let's be extra safe," the doctor said, without going into details about how Naya could have gotten infected. She was hesitant to talk about the rape herself. She wanted to tell more, but her shame tied her tongue. A few days later, she came back to the clinic. The doctor invited her into his office and looked at her with deep compassion. "Your HIV test result is positive." It came as a bolt from the blue. Yes, she had been suspecting the worst ever since the crime, but to hear the confirmation from the doctor's lips was a real blow. She felt the world begin to tilt, as if she were going to faint. Doctor, why?" Naya could hardly get the words out. The doctor explained that HIV is often sexually transmitted, and the rape could have been the cause. He said that the symptoms she was experiencing were probably indicative of the primary stage of the infection and advised her to start ARV therapy immediately and monitor her immune system. Naya sat with her head down, tears rolling down her cheeks. All she could hear through the chaos was HIV. Although the doctor tried to explain that nowadays it is possible to live with it for decades, suggested that she turn to psychologists and support groups, the girl did not seem to listen to him. The memories of that terrible night, when 3 attackers crippled her mentally and physically, haunted her even more now. After all, they left their mark not only in her memories but also in her blood. She did not want to tell her mother, who was far away, everything. Nor could she bear the looks of pity from her friends and acquaintances. A wild cocktail of shame, rage, and despair was brewing inside her. It seemed as if life had stopped from now on. What was the point of pushing on, of trying for a career or a relationship, if the diagnosis inevitably changed reality? She was consumed by the thought, why me? After all, I never took risks on purpose. Now the grave consequences of that rape have become not only a trauma to the psyche, but also an irreversible health problem. Only a few days have passed since her HIV status was officially confirmed. At first, Naya tried to follow the doctor's advice. She went to a free consultation where she was told about antiretroviral therapy and monitoring tests. However, the atmosphere there was depressing. People sat in silence in long lines, some looking completely overwhelmed or depressed. She felt she could barely cope with it. Finally, when she returned to her cramped, gloomy room, with its old wallpaper and rickety bed, she realized that the current situation only made her feel more hopeless. The realization that she remained HIV positive because of those inhumane people was heartbreaking. For an hour, Naya lay staring at the ceiling, where traces of old moisture were darkening, shivering from cold and nerves. Thoughts of how things could have turned out differently kept coming back to her. If only she hadn't chosen that particular road that night. That same evening, she sat down at her laptop and started searching. How to live with HIV. Is there a cure? And read the stories of those who unfortunately got into a similar predicament due to violence. As she reviewed these testimonies, her fear gradually turned into despair. An incomprehensible mix of pain and rage was brewing inside her, at the perpetrators, at fate, at everything that was happening around her. When my mother called, she would make excuses that she was overwhelmed with work because she didn't dare to say anything. She hardly spoke to her friends either. She felt so devastated that she didn't care if anyone knew about her condition. After a few days of lying in bed with a minimum of food and a maximum of sad thoughts, Naya decided to go to the nearest convenience store that was open 24/7, late at night, and bought a cheap bottle of wine. She had hardly ever drunk alcohol before, except for the occasional glass on a holiday. Now in her cramped room, she simply opened the bottle and gulped down the wine until she felt a burning bitterness in her chest. It burned her throat, but it made her forget for a while. She spent the rest of that evening in fragments of sleep, between sobs and depressing thoughts. In the morning, she woke up with a throbbing headache and a feeling of nausea, but she noted for a moment that she hadn't felt so sick inside during the night's forgetfulness. It seems to be working, she thought with bitter irony. So she decided to drink again. That was the beginning of her journey into addiction. At first, she limited herself to small doses, but soon they increased. A week passed, and several empty bottles had already accumulated in her room. Instead of studying in textbooks, her evenings turned into binge drinking, full of hopelessness. After a while, she began to feel guilty. She missed classes, and her teachers sent letters with questions. "Where did you go? Do you need support?" She tried to return to one of the lectures, but those who had seen her before immediately started asking questions. "Are you sick? Is everything okay?" Naya could not share the truth. She felt as if she was standing on a precipice. She sat in her literature class hungover and silently tormented herself with the thought, "Why am I here at all?" As soon as the class was over, she felt an overwhelming urge to drink again, or to disconnect from reality altogether. The city, of course, offered dozens of options for cheap alcohol. Going to the nearest bar, she ordered 2 shots of strong drink and downed them all at once. At the time, she liked the feeling of alcohol washing away reality, even though it was only destroying her from the inside. One evening, when she was returning from a bar, she ran into a stranger smoking marijuana at the entrance. He offered her to relax a bit, and she agreed, ignoring all her reservations. At first, she got high and felt a slight euphoria, like a brief escape from her problems. When a young man who called himself AJ invited her to a house party, she didn't even hesitate. It seemed to her that just disappearing into the midst of a noisy group was exactly what she wanted. At that party, someone offered her ecstasy. "Drink it, you'll relax, feel euphoric in light of the whole world." She swallowed one pill and then took another. The music seemed enchanting, the touch of strangers pleasant, because Naya was too mentally exhausted to realize the danger. And when she woke up the next morning, it turned out that she had long missed taking her HIV medication on time. A few weeks of this lifestyle had thrown her far away from who she had been before. Evening outings became a regular occurrence, and any attempt to stay sober was accompanied by new breakdowns. It was then that a devastating decision came to her mind. Since the world was so cruel, and her fate seemed to be hopelessly falling into the abyss, perhaps she should respond in kind. Not instantly, but gradually, she came to the idea of retribution. She often dreamed of those 3 attackers like 3 nameless shadows. It seemed that any loud man with a confident laugh could be one of them. She began to openly disregard the guys who, after drinking, would let their hands go or boast about their achievements. One day, while working in a bar, she met a brazen visitor with an arrogant smile. He invited her for a drink and then actually demanded to continue their acquaintance. Naya felt disgusted and simultaneously thought, "Everyone is the same. Why not pass on this misfortune to him?" She silently concealed her HIV status. The same night, they ended up at his house, and they had unprotected sex. When it was over, the man fell asleep, and she packed her things and left, feeling a certain strange relief. "Now you'll have to bear it," she thought. "In the morning after I sobered up, I realized the horror of my actions. What have I done?" she asked herself. But remembering her own story, scrolling through an imaginary rape scenario, she calmed herself with the thought, "Didn't they care that they were infecting me?" and seemed to find an excuse. Later, she continued this sinister tactic. Naya went to clubs more often, easily finding casual partners. On the background of alcohol and drugs, she felt the painful reality less and left them her virus. No one realized that this petite girl had HIV. Many people did not even bother to protect themselves during casual sex. Eventually, she began to realize that she had become something of a spreader. She had no idea how many people she had transmitted the disease to. Some evenings, she would end with 2 new victims at once. After that, she would return to her abandoned room, powerless and as if devastated from the inside. All of this seemed to her a kind of retaliation, meaningless, painful, and cruel, but one that she could not refuse. A few months later, people with similar complaints, fever, swollen lymph nodes, and constant fatigue, began to visit clinics en masse. As a result, most of them were diagnosed with HIV, and it was stunning. Where did it come from? How did it happen? They wondered. Most patients admitted that they had unprotected casual sex, and almost everyone recalled a similar story, a dark-skinned stranger with different names, sometimes Nia, sometimes Mia, sometimes without any introduction at all, because the acquaintance was a one-time thing and took place after a couple of cocktails or a bottle of beer. They would wake up in the morning and she would be long gone. Among the newly infected were students, office workers, and even married men. All of them, of course, did not want to advertise their diagnosis. But when it turned out that these were not isolated cases, rumors started to spread. A young girl was wandering around, deliberately spreading HIV. Journalists immediately started covering the story because it sounded scary and sensational. Officer Jackson, known for her 15 years of experience and numerous successful cases involving violence and drug crimes, joined the investigation. But even she faced something atypical. Serial HIV transmission was something almost unheard of for her. Talking to doctors who recorded new cases, she learned that in just 2 months there were several dozen victims, and she could not even imagine how many had not yet come forward. From the general descriptions, she managed to roughly draw up a portrait of the distributor, a fragile, dark-skinned girl of about 20 to 25 years old, could speak with or without an accent. Hairstyle varied from short hair to braided braids. The common feature was that she usually operated in bars and clubs, offering quick sex. Officer Jackson approached the club owners to review their security footage. Occasionally, a dark female figure could be seen leaving the premises in the company of a man. However, the quality often left much to be desired, and the lighting was poor, making it extremely difficult to recognize the face. What if she's not aware of her status or is doing this unintentionally? Jackson asked herself. However, a number of circumstances indicated that too many cases followed the same scenario to be considered coincidence. Meanwhile, Naya herself was feeling extremely uneasy. She had heard conversations in the same bars about some mysterious viral girl. Under her skin, she felt fear and shame, but at the same time, something did not allow her to stop, as if the idea of finishing what she started was burning inside her. Jackson and her colleagues set out to catch her in the act, or at least find someone who could provide an accurate description of the dangerous stranger. They monitored all reports from various bars and nightclubs where similar incidents were recorded. Internal guidelines were posted in each police station. If anyone noticed a girl offering to go out with men or to their place, they should immediately report and detain her. Meanwhile, television programs began to actively discuss the HIV outbreak that was spreading among young men. On air, psychologists speculated that perhaps the perpetrator had become a victim herself and was now consciously or unconsciously taking revenge. Warning posts appeared on social media. Choose your partner carefully, don't take risks. Some people expressed aggression. She needs to be dealt with in a demonstrative manner. While others, on the contrary, sympathized. If she survived the rape and was left with HIV, how could her psyche have broken down? All of these conflicting views provoked debate in the community, and Officer Jackson was adamant that the reasons, tragic though they were, did not justify the crime. After all, dozens or even hundreds of people could now be doomed to a serious illness. Naya could feel the ring closing. More than once in bars, she heard snippets of conversations when someone quietly mentioned a mysterious girl who was allegedly spreading HIV and that the police were already working hard on the case. At first, she didn't seem to care. She was deeply depressed and had no desire to think about the future. However, the more she went on, the more she was gnawed by the realization that one day she could be tracked down and captured. Sometimes she even thought about moving to another state, but she didn't have enough money to escape. Her physical and psychological condition was getting worse with each passing day. Now, Naya almost always needed several doses of ecstasy or other psychoactive substances to get through the next hunt. Without it, she no longer had the composure. She would come to the club, look for a victim, and win him over with dancing, hints, and smiles. Sometimes she would provoke the man to buy the drinks himself, or she would offer them something to take together. Often they took it because nightlife in bars is inseparable from alcohol and sometimes drugs. The fact that she did not mention contraceptives and behaved too safely did not alarm anyone. Most people considered this behavior to be a normal adventure, without thinking about the dangers it could conceal. For Naya, her own body turned into an instrument of revenge. Every time she woke up in someone else's home with a broken head and trembling joints, she thought, "Now you have joined my ship." Or, "They are all the same. They are frivolous and so evil." But on a deeper level, she was exhausted by guilt, forcing her to seek comfort in alcohol. Sometimes she would ask herself, "Have I gone too far? Maybe I should stop." But resentment and despair quickly overcame these doubts. Among her former friends was a girl named Rachel, who had shared a dorm room with her as a student and knew to some extent what she was going through. When Rachel noticed that Naya had disappeared from college, she started trying to get in touch with her, sending her messages and calling her. But Naya either did not answer or said very little, quickly changing the subject. One day, Rachel decided to drive directly to Naya's apartment, only to find the door locked and hear loud music or a TV playing through it. It was possible that Naya was inside, but she did not open the door. Around the same time, Rachel learned at college that Naya had missed all of her exams and was effectively expelled, an obvious sign of trouble. Although some of her friends tried to pull her back into life, she stubbornly rejected any help, fearing that her friends might find out about her HIV status and blame her. She felt that her identity had been destroyed. She had lost her future, her dreams, and her self-identity. The men from the nightclubs were just a tool in her strange struggle. Meanwhile, the Daily City News published an article titled, "Youth with HIV Outbreak, Police Suspect Intentional Infection." Officer Jackson was cautious in her comments, only hinting that the investigation was ongoing and that the public could help in finding witnesses. The press ruthlessly promoted the story of a mysterious girl taking revenge on the world for her own tragedy. Apparently, one of the police officers leaked information that she herself could have been a victim of violence. This outraged civic activists because such details should not be disclosed, as they only generate gossip and violate ethics. And these newspaper articles showed Nyjah that the case had attracted wide publicity. She became increasingly worried that her appearance or name would soon be in the public domain or in the press. The thought of fleeing somewhere, changing her documents, crossed her mind, but she did not have the financial resources to take such a drastic step. Her health and psychological state were deteriorating at a frightening rate. At the same time, the police found new video footage from nightclubs, which showed a similar silhouetted figure leaving hand in hand with a man. The picture was not very clear, but Officer Jackson picked up on repeated details. A young black girl, thin, the same height, and in both videos, wearing a short leather jacket of a similar shade. Later, the police began checking social media, but no clear images were found. Almost all of the infected men also did not have her photos. One victim, in a depressed state, recalled a friend who had noticed their company that night at the bar's exit. The man confirmed, "She has a special mark, a scar or spot near her left eyebrow. I noticed it right away because it seemed unusual and maybe beautiful." Jackson added this detail to the APB. Soon another clue turned up. One of the victims recalled that night he and the girl were caught on camera in a nearby supermarket. They were seen walking around the corner of the store, and then only the girl came back from behind the building. After making a freeze frame, the police realized that she resembled a student or a young office worker. Soon they started asking people in colleges and dormitories if anyone recognized the person. But so far, nothing concrete has come up. Naya realized on some level that the circle was closing. Her health was noticeably deteriorating. Due to depression and complete confusion, she almost did not adhere to the ARV regimen. Her body pains intensified, she lost her appetite, and sometimes she suffered from fevers. As soon as she felt a little better, she would turn to alcohol and ecstasy again. Two voices seemed to coexist in her mind, one claiming that, as a victim, she had the right to take revenge, the other reminding her of the inevitable evil she was doing and warning her of a catastrophic ending. In her dreams, she began to see images of three mysterious silhouettes mocking her in the dark, and then the men she had been involved with would also appear in her dreams, confronting her with accusations. Waking up in a cold sweat and shivering, Naya craved another dose of something to drown out the nightmare. One night, a confident young man of about 25 approached her outside a club and asked her to smell something in his car. She agreed. They had unprotected sexual intercourse there. About half an hour later, Naya, barely able to stand, got out of the car. She realized that this was probably her 40th or 50th partner. When she got to the intersection, she ran into two policemen. Noticing her inadequate state, they started asking her for documents, and she panicked and ran to a nearby alley. The patrol policeman did not pursue her, apparently thinking she was an ordinary drug addict. The very thought of the cops being so close squeezed her heart. At a routine meeting at the station, Officer Jackson told her colleagues that about 30 people had officially confirmed that they had had sex with this HIV infector, and the number was still growing. All described a 20 to 25-year-old black girl with a frail build who often acted as if she were under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Some mentioned a light stain near her eyebrow. After comparing the video footage, the police visited several bars. The bartenders recognized him. Yes, there was a girl like that. She got drunk, then went out with her husband. However, no one knew her name. It looks like we're close, Jackson sighed, but we need to catch her directly, or at least figure out where she lives. She also sent official inquiries to several colleges, as she assumed the girl might be a student. Meanwhile, there was talk in the city about a fatal stranger, and stories appeared on social media that someone had almost fallen into her hands. Some people thought she should be punished severely. Others expressed sympathy, suggesting that she had been raped herself and was now taking revenge. Naya, meanwhile, was sinking deeper and deeper into the drug veil, feeling herself gradually sinking into a hopelessness. I am a monster, she told herself, and at the same time I am a victim. This internal conflict was eating away at her psyche from the inside. The morning was gray and unfriendly. Heavy clouds covered the sky, ready to pour down. Naya got out of bed at almost noon and looked around the room. Half-drunk bottles were lying on the floor, scraps were visible here and there, and pills were scattered randomly next to the bed. She felt dirty and exhausted. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could hardly make normal gestures. Memories of the night before or the night before were scrolling through her mind, all merging into one endless, dark night. I remembered appearing in some club again, taking something, going somewhere with my husband. Everything appeared in scattered episodes. Someone's face, silent music, someone else's touch. Apparently this was another prey, another person to whom she had passed on her illness. Suddenly the scene of the brutal attack that happened a few months ago, after which she became like this, came to mind. I also remembered that the police were almost close to solving the serial infector. She became scared. Naya did not want to be detained. But at the same time, she realized that she might decide to do something extreme if the pressure continued to increase. After hastily changing into a relatively clean dress, Naya started looking for at least a packet of chips to satisfy her hunger. Then she looked in the mirror. There she saw a girl with empty eyes who had once been a cheerful student, but now had lost her dreams and hopes. A thought flashed through her mind. Maybe I should turn myself in to the police or find those who ruined my life. But she immediately realized that she would not dare to go to the police station without any evidence or strength to explain anything. Trying to ward off these thoughts, she gritted her teeth, grabbed her phone, and left, heading for a gas station near where a shop selling alcohol and illegal pills was open around the clock. That same night, Officer Jackson and her colleagues set up a trap in one of the bars where the same girl was rumored to have been seen. The bar had a bright red neon sign and attracted young people with cheap cocktails and loud dancing. The police sat in a corner, dressed as ordinary customers to avoid standing out, and the security guard was instructed to call immediately if he spotted anyone matching the description. Jackson held a cocktail glass in her hands as if enjoying the atmosphere, while keeping a close eye on the movement of the people on the dance floor. The flickering light merged with the smoke, creating an almost psychedelic picture. Dancing, laughing, couples disappearing toward the restrooms or the exit. The perfect place to find her next victim without being seen, she thought. It was getting late, but the object still hadn't appeared. Suddenly, she heard a signal from the guard. "I think she's here," Jackson signaled to her partner. Out of the corner of their eye, they saw the newcomer, dark-skinned, slender, with a short jacket. She was adjusting her hair as if she was looking around the room for something. Jackson's heart began to race. "I think that's her," the officer thought, barely audibly. Jackson watched as the girl walked over to the bar, took a glass, downed something strong, and ducked into the back of the room, where the disco lights flickered. A few minutes later, she was already talking animatedly with a group of guys, but she was paying special attention to a tall young man. They were laughing, talking too closely, and she put her hand on his shoulder, a classic seduction technique. Realizing that another incident was about to happen, the police team decided to intervene, but they did not want to create panic among the visitors. Jackson was about to go to the couple when it turned out that they had disappeared behind a door labeled "Staff Only." Reacting to this, she jumped up from her seat and gestured to her colleague, ordering him to go around the other side. At the time, Naya, under the influence of alcohol and ecstasy, was leading her new friend down a dark corridor behind the stage. She was overwhelmed by contradictory feelings, an acute fear that she was about to be exposed, but at the same time complimented by uncontrollable desire. "I wonder if they'll catch me for sure this time," she thought. But as usual, her anger and despair prevailed, so she distracted the man with conversation and led him on. When the corridor door opened and Naya noticed Officer Jackson and her partner standing there, blocking the exit, the ground seemed to slip from under her feet. "Don't move," Jackson said, showing her police badge. The young man jumped to the side, clearly not realizing what was happening. Naya looked up, cursing softly, "Fuck," and started to back away. Her partner already had handcuffs in his hands, intending to detain her. However, panicked, Naya put up an unexpected fight. She sharply pushed the policeman away, knocked his arm out, and ran to the side. There was a small commotion in the corridor, and the officer tried to grab her, but she pulled away, scratching his forearm. Jackson, trying to block the way, did not react quickly enough, and Naya slipped back into the crowded hall. The music was blaring, and the lights were swirling. Few people noticed that a woman, her face distorted with horror, was making her way through the crowd. Jackson shouted, "Stop her! It's the police!" But her voice was drowned out by the loud rhythms of the dance floor. Continuing to push her way through, Naya pushed a few people away, made it to the back door, and darted out into the narrow courtyard behind the bar. It was dirty and damp, with garbage cans everywhere and dim lamps illuminating the space. Out of breath, Naya tried to jump over a low metal fence, but landed on her knees. It seemed as if she was running out of air, and the thought, "Run, run," pulsed through her brain. Within seconds, Jackson and her partner jumped out after her. "Stop! Don't move!" the officer shouted, her voice strained. Panicked, Naya reached into her small purse and pulled out a handful of pills. Most likely, these were the same drugs she was trying to distract her mind with. After a moment, she looked Officer Jackson in the eye, and in one motion threw a handful of pills into her mouth. The officer tried to stop her by shouting, "Don't do anything stupid." But it was too late. Naya had swallowed a lethal dose of various drugs, sedatives or stimulants. She wanted everything to end. The arrest, the suffering, the pain. Her body suddenly trembled, and she tried to take a few steps, but swayed. Jackson rushed over to catch her, but she didn't have time. Naya fell face down on the dirty asphalt, dropping her purse. The policewoman frantically called an ambulance, shouting, "We need an ambulance! She's overdosed!" For many minutes, they tried in every way possible to bring the girl to consciousness. They turned her on her side, applied basic resuscitation techniques, but the effects of drugs and prolonged exhaustion took their toll. When the medical team finally arrived, Naya was still breathing weakly. However, in the ambulance, despite all the efforts of the doctors, her pulse disappeared completely. This was the end of the life of a 21-year-old girl who had once been trapped in a rape and terminal illness, found no other way out but to take violent revenge, and eventually died of her own hopelessness. As Officer Jackson watched the doctors try to resuscitate her, she felt a burning sense of powerlessness. We were just a moment too late, she thought bitterly. The news spread through the city in no time. Magazines and TV channels reported, a woman who was probably deliberately transmitting HIV to men died of an overdose while in custody. Social media was abuzz with controversy, as victims who had found out their diagnosis were angry. Now she has escaped punishment. Others, on the contrary, emphasized, society didn't notice that she herself had been hacked once, and she was desperate to do this. There were also questions to the police. Could they have done anything differently? Was it possible to save her? Some of her friends who remembered the old Naya confirmed that she used to be an ordinary shy girl. Everyone asked what had pushed her to take such steps. Over time, it became clear that the probable reason was the rape during which she contracted HIV. As a result, we get a general outcome where no one wins. Numerous men have to live with the disease now, and Naya, who once dreamed of something great, left this world without achieving justice for her offenders. All that remains is a discussion in the community about whether she could have avoided this fate if law enforcement and others had helped her cope with her trauma in time. As Officer Jackson was writing her report, she described the details of what happened and wondered if the girl had received psychological and medical support immediately after the crime and been taught how not to endanger others. Would the outcome have been different? But it is impossible to turn back the clock. All of this turned into a tragic story about the indifference of society, which gave a chance to a senseless revenge to be born. Naya wasn't born a villain, but she became one after being mentally and physically crippled. The trauma of rape, severe illness, and loneliness drove her to drugs and alcohol, and then to serial infection of men. The worst ending, when she chose to overdose after being arrested and persecuted, is more indicative of the overall fatality of the situation than of a simple crime. No one emerged victorious in this drama. Dozens of men will now be infected with HIV, bearing deep psychological scars. Naya herself, who had previously dreamed of a fulfilling future, died without achieving punishment for her abusers or gaining any chance for healing. Society will remember this incident for a long time, concluding that one horrific night can trigger a chain of bloody retribution and self-destruction, and that the real tragedy lies in the general indifference.